I never thought a stadium filled with tens of thousands of people could feel so overwhelmingly lonely. That feeling of being a ghost in a room full of life is what I want to share with you today. So if you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please consider following our channel, RP, Romantic Promises, hitting that like button, and giving us some hype to help us keep creating. I'm Harper, a 35-year-old architect from Los Angeles, and I've spent the better part of my adult life building structures for other people's dreams, while mine stayed buried under blueprints and deadlines. The summer heat in 2026 is stifling, and with the World Cup taking over the city, it feels like everyone has someone to share the excitement with. My days have become a predictable gray cycle of work, empty apartment, and late-night revisions that lead absolutely nowhere. I'm not unhappy in a traditional sense, but I'm hollow, as if I'm just waiting for a life that hasn't started yet. There's a specific kind of ache that comes from being surrounded by passion when you feel nothing but a steady, quiet numbness. I've tried everything to kickstart my pulse, from late-night gym sessions to expensive hobbies, but nothing really sticks. It's like living behind a thick glass wall, watching the world move in vibrant color while everything I touch stays muted. That's why, when I saw the schedule for the World Cup, I impulsively bought a ticket to a match I didn't have any logical reason to attend. The Japanese national team was playing, a group I've secretly admired for their discipline and elegance, even though I don't know a single word of their language. I needed to be somewhere where the energy was so loud it might force its way into my chest. Walking toward the stadium, the air was thick with the scent of sunscreen, popcorn, and asphalt, radiating the afternoon sun. I wore my favorite team colors, trying to blend in, trying to participate in the collective joy that seemed to possess every stranger I passed. There's a strange comfort in being just another face in the crowd, invisible but part of something larger. My seat was in the middle of a row filled with fans who were already chanting and waving flags, their voices blending into a singular rhythmic roar. I sat down and folded my arms, watching them with a mixture of envy and curiosity, wondering what it felt like to be that invested in something outside yourself. It's a foreign language, this kind of uninhibited happiness. As the players walked onto the pitch, the roar grew to a deafening volume, and I found myself scanning the faces around me, looking for a mirror of my own quiet observation. Most people were screaming or hugging their friends, creating small pockets of intimacy that I didn't have access to. The isolation felt heavier than usual, contrasted against the massive shared excitement. I took a long sip of my water, letting the cold liquid ground me against the sweltering heat of the stands. The stadium felt infinite, a giant bowl of noise that threatened to drown out the voice in my head. I wondered if anyone else here was also just looking for a reason to feel something real today. My eyes wandered over the rows of blue jerseys, the colors blurring into a sea of determined, hopeful fans. There's a beauty in that kind of hope, a simplicity that I've forgotten how to cultivate in my own life. I shifted in my seat, my gaze drifting away from the pitch and back to the people who were actually living the moment. The woman sitting 2 rows ahead stood up to cheer, and for a second, the light caught her profile perfectly against the bright blue of the stadium seats. She was alone, too, clutching her flag with a tight grip, looking around with a hesitant, wide-eyed expression that looked nothing like the rest of the cheering fans. There was a vulnerability in her posture that caught me off guard. She looked lost, her eyes darting between her phone and the field, as if she were trying to decode a language she didn't fully understand. It wasn't the frantic confusion of a lost tourist, but a deeper, quieter kind of displacement that felt intimately familiar to me. I couldn't look away, and for the first time all day, my heart skipped a beat for a reason that had nothing to do with the game. I felt a sudden, sharp pull in my stomach, an urge to move, to cross the space between us and offer some kind of anchor in this sea of strangers. She turned her head, and our eyes met across the rows of cheering bodies, and the entire world around us seemed to stop. She had no idea that in that single look, she'd just become the only thing that mattered in the entire stadium. The energy in the stadium was suffocatingly thick, buzzing with a tension that didn't belong to me, but I found myself constantly distracted from the pitch. My attention kept drifting, not to the athletes chasing the ball, but to the small, quiet figure seated a few rows ahead of me. She looked completely out of place among the sea of screaming fans, her movements tentative and unsure as she gripped her phone with both hands. It was like watching a delicate flower trying to survive in a storm, and for some reason, I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. She was struggling with something on her screen, her brow furrowed in a way that pulled at my chest. It looked like she was having trouble with her digital ticket, the bright glare of the sun making it even harder for her to navigate the app. I watched her glance around, her eyes wide and searching, looking for someone who could help, but finding only strangers lost in their own excitement. Every time the crowd erupted into a roar, she would flinch slightly, pulling her shoulders up toward her ears. I felt a strange, magnetic pull in my stomach, an urge that was both terrifying and impossible to ignore. My life has been defined by caution, by staying within the lines of my own comfortable, albeit lonely existence. Yet, seeing her there, so clearly lost in a foreign country during one of the most intense events on the planet, shifted something inside me. I realized that if I didn't reach out, I would regret it for the rest of the game, and perhaps longer. I stood up, my knees feeling a little weak as I navigated through the narrow row of seats. The crowd was a chaotic obstacle course, people jumping and shouting, but I moved with a focused determination I hadn't felt in a long time. I had to get to her before she gave up, or felt even more alienated by the noise. The scent of stadium fries and sunscreen felt intense, but beneath it, I could catch the faint, clean scent of her hair, like jasmine or tea as I got closer. When I finally reached her row, she was staring at her phone with an expression of such pure, quiet despair that I nearly stopped. I cleared my throat, feeling incredibly awkward, and tapped lightly on the shoulder of the person next to her to ask to pass. She looked up, and for a split second she looked frightened, her dark eyes wide and searching mine. She had the most striking features, skin like porcelain, and lips that looked soft, even in the harsh light of the afternoon. I gestured to her phone with a gentle smile, trying to radiate as much calmness as I could muster. She looked at me, then at the phone, and I saw the recognition of someone who was exhausted by the effort of trying to figure things out alone. I pointed to the gate number and then to the stadium map on my own phone, showing her how to refresh her pass. It was a simple gesture, but the way her face transformed from anxiety to relief was like a spotlight hitting a dark stage. She didn't speak, but she nodded frantically, her gratitude shining through in the way she leaned into my space. The language barrier was an immediate physical thing between us, a wall that we both knew we couldn't easily climb. Yet, in that moment, the communication felt clearer than any words could have been. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she held her phone up, and I found myself reaching out to steady her wrist. Her skin was cool against my warm fingers, a contrast that sent a shiver straight up my arm. I realized then that I wasn't just helping a stranger. I was making a connection that felt heavier, more meaningful than I had anticipated. She murmured something in Japanese, her voice soft and melodic, completely lost on me, but the warmth in her tone was unmistakable. I just smiled and shook my head, letting her know it was all right, that she was safe now. We stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the roar of the stadium fading into a background hum that no longer mattered. I could see the reflection of the giant screen in her eyes, flickering with the colors of the match, but her focus was entirely on me. It was a dizzying experience, to be seen so clearly by someone who didn't even know my name. The vulnerability she projected was something I recognized instantly, because it was a mirror of my own. I gestured to the empty seat beside her, a silent question that hung heavy in the humid summer air. She hesitated, a blush creeping up her cheeks, and then she nodded, a small, shy smile playing on her lips. I sat down, the fabric of our jerseys brushing together, a microscopic distance that felt like a bridge being built across a chasm. The air between us was suddenly charged with something that made my heart race faster than the game ever could. As the match resumed with a fresh burst of energy from the crowd, I barely glanced at the field. I was too occupied with the way she breathed, the way she shifted in her seat to be closer to me, and the way she occasionally glanced my way. I felt a sense of belonging that was entirely new, a tether to the world that I hadn't known I was missing. It was as if I'd been walking through a fog for years and had suddenly stepped into the light. The game was progressing, but I was living in a different world, one that was contained entirely within the few feet of space we shared. I looked at her, realizing she was watching the game with a newfound sense of ease, occasionally glancing at me with a curiosity that matched my own. The quiet hum of our proximity was the most exciting thing I'd experienced in years, and I knew, with a sudden, terrifying certainty, that this day was only the beginning of something that would change everything. We didn't share a language, but as the match intensified, the noise of the stadium became a symphony that we were composing together. I found myself watching her more than the pitch, fascinated by the way her hands moved when she was excited. She looked so graceful, even when she was cheering in a way that was entirely new to me. It felt like we were in our own quiet pocket of the world, shielded by the roar of the crowd. Every time Japan made a move, she would gasp, her fingers digging into the fabric of my jersey by accident. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned in slightly, mirroring her excitement. It was the first time I felt like I was actually part of something instead of just observing it from the sidelines. Her eyes lit up with a fire that seemed to spread to me, thawing the frozen parts of my spirit. She tried to explain something to me, pointing at the screen and saying something in her native tongue that I couldn't understand. I just laughed, a sound that felt rusty from lack of use, and shrugged my shoulders to show her it was okay. We smiled at each other, and in that simple exchange, the barrier between our cultures seemed to evaporate. It was just two people, sharing the electric tension of the game. I pointed to the clock, then to the field, and she nodded in understanding, her expression softening into something incredibly sweet. She was so expressive without needing to speak, her eyebrows arching in surprise or her mouth opening in delight. It was a dance of gestures that felt intimate and deliberate. I started to notice the faint scent of floral perfume on her, mixed with the sharp, clean air of the stadium. The game moved forward with a frantic pace, and every time the ball got close to the goal, we would both stand up in unison. We were perfectly in sync, two strangers moving with a rhythm that had no explanation. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't just the sport. It was the proximity of this woman who had wandered into my life. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this present, this alive. When Japan finally scored, she let out a cry of pure, unadulterated joy and turned to me, grabbing my arms in a sudden hug. For a heartbeat, time stood absolutely still, the weight of her body against mine grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I hugged her back, feeling the warmth radiating from her through her jersey. It was a fleeting contact, but it left a lingering heat on my skin. We pulled back, both of us breathless and grinning like children, our faces flushed from the heat and the excitement. She apologized, bowing her head slightly, but I just waved it off, my hand brushing against her cheek for a split second. The touch was electric, a jolt that sent a hum through my nerves. She didn't pull away, and for a moment, her gaze lingered on mine with a depth that felt heavy with unspoken words. The rest of the match felt like a blur, a backdrop to the quiet conversation our bodies were having. We leaned into each other, sharing space that felt earned rather than taken. I realized I was starting to crave her reactions more than I cared about the final score. She was a revelation, a sudden burst of color in my monochrome world that I didn't want to lose. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, something I hadn't known in 3,000 days or more. It was as if I had been holding my breath for an entire lifetime, and was finally allowed to exhale. We were two disparate souls, drifting in the same current, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the water. I wanted to stay in this moment forever. As the final whistle blew, the stadium erupted, a tidal wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the earth beneath us. We stood together, cheering and clapping, caught up in the triumph of the team she had traveled so far to support. It was a victory. But the real win felt like something much more personal. Something that was blooming between us right there in the stands. People began to filter out, a slow-moving river of blue jerseys heading toward the exits. But we stayed put for a moment, reluctant to let the spell break. She turned to me, her eyes sparkling with residual adrenaline, and she said something again, her tone expectant. I gestured toward the outside, toward the bustling streets of Los Angeles, and then to a nearby bar, hoping she would understand. I wanted to keep the conversation going, even if we had to invent our own language to do it. She looked at my invitation, then back at me, a flicker of hesitation passing through her eyes before she nodded with a bright, beautiful smile. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage, knowing that this was a step into something I couldn't turn back from. We turned and began the walk out of the stadium, and as we moved into the warm summer air, I knew the night was only just getting started. The final whistle blew, and the stadium erupted into a chaotic symphony of cheers and groans. I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't felt in years, a buzzing sensation under my skin that made it impossible to stay still. We joined the slow-moving river of people shuffling toward the exits, the summer heat pressing against us like a physical weight. My shoulder brushed against hers, a deliberate, grounding contact that made the vast crowd feel smaller, more intimate. I could feel her excitement vibrating off her, a contagious warmth that was quickly becoming the only thing I cared about. The bar we found was just a few blocks away, a local spot already packed with jubilant fans still buzzing from the game. We squeezed through the doorway, the sudden rush of air-conditioned air hitting us like a blessing against the stifling afternoon. The place was dimly lit, illuminated by the flickering glow of neon beer signs and the hum of countless conversations blending into one. It felt like stepping into a secret world, a sanctuary from the relentless glare of the sun. We managed to snag 2 stools at a corner of the long wooden counter, the surface sticky and worn. I ordered 2 beers, using gestures and a hopeful smile, and she watched me with that same wide-eyed curiosity that made my breath hitch. When the drinks arrived, the cold condensation on the glass felt refreshing against my palm. We clinked our glasses together, a silent toast to the game, to the day, and to the strange magnetic pull that kept us sitting close. The atmosphere in the bar was heavy with heat and laughter, a stark contrast to the hollow silence of my usual evenings. We didn't share a language, but we laughed at the same things, our eyes meeting across the rim of our glasses. I felt a reckless kind of courage bubbling up in me, a desire to prolong this moment until it stretched into something more. It was like living in a dream, where every barrier I'd ever built was slowly, quietly dissolving. Then, the rhythm of our evening was interrupted by a presence that crowded into our small space. A man, loud and clearly emboldened by too many drinks, slid onto the stool next to her, his voice booming over the music. He leaned in far too close, his gaze roaming over her with a casual entitlement that made my skin crawl. I watched as she shifted, her posture stiffening, her hand tightening around her glass until her knuckles turned white. She looked at me, a flicker of genuine discomfort crossing her face, her eyes searching mine for an exit strategy. I could see the way she tried to deflect him with a polite, shaky smile, but he just laughed, his hand resting too heavily on the counter near her arm. My internal alarm bells started ringing, a sharp, protective instinct igniting in my chest. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was part of a dynamic that demanded I take a stand. I didn't have to think twice. The protectiveness I felt was stronger than any fear of social awkwardness. I slid my stool closer, creating a physical barrier between her and the intruder, and rested my hand firmly on her shoulder. My gaze was fixed on him, steady and unwavering, a silent command that was impossible to mistake. I didn't need to say a word to make it clear that he was encroaching on space that belonged to us. The man looked at me, then at the way my hand rested on her, and something in his expression shifted from arrogance to confusion I gave him a curt, dismissive nod, my face an unreadable mask of determination. He hesitated for a second, sensing the shift in the air, before grumbling something under his breath and sliding away to find a different target. I watched him go, the tension in my shoulders finally beginning to bleed away. She exhaled a breath she'd clearly been holding, her body leaning back into mine as the immediate threat vanished. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of relief and a newfound, intense gratitude. The way she looked at me in that moment was different. There was a depth to it, a realization of the protection I had offered. It felt like we had just crossed an invisible line, shifting our dynamic from strangers to something more. The noise of the bar seemed to swell around us again, but it was just white noise compared to the sudden clarity I felt. I realized that I didn't want to be in this crowded, loud place anymore. I wanted to be somewhere where I could hear her voice, even if I couldn't understand it. The air was getting too thick, the neon lights too distracting, and the need for space where we could truly be alone hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I stood up, holding my hand out to her, a silent invitation to leave the noise behind. She didn't hesitate, her fingers curling around mine with a trust that made my heart hammer against my ribs. We moved through the crowded bar, our joined hands a beacon in the dark, the scent of her perfume trailing behind her like a promise. The world outside felt cooler, the city lights painting our path in shades of electric blue and gold. We reached the entrance to the restroom, a small, quiet hallway tucked away from the main chaos of the bar. It was an excuse, a place to escape the roar. But as we stepped into the dim, artificial light, I felt the air grow heavy and charged. I stopped, and she turned to face me, the reflection of the lights catching the dark, depth-filled mystery of her eyes. This was the moment where everything was going to change, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no going back. The hallway was a sudden vacuum of sound, the roaring energy of the bar left behind as we stepped into the relative silence of the tiled space. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, an erratic rhythm that I couldn't seem to calm, no matter how hard I tried. The air in here felt cooler, a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from the crowd we had just escaped. May stood close to me, her breathing shallow and fast, her eyes darting toward the mirror before settling on my face with an intensity that made me dizzy. We were alone, just the two of us, and the boundary of our personal space had completely dissolved. I walked toward the sink, needing something to do with my hands, and splashed a little cold water on my wrists to stop them from shaking. When I looked up at the mirror, I saw her reflection, not looking at her own appearance, but watching me with an expression of open, unguarded vulnerability. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were walking through deep water. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the hum of unspoken things that had been building since the moment we met in the stadium. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from my arm, and I could feel the heat radiating from her skin even without contact. I turned around, and we were suddenly so close that I could count the tiny, individual lashes fringing her eyes. It felt as if we were standing on the edge of a cliff, the air beneath our feet missing, and the only thing keeping us upright was the gravity of our mutual attraction. My previous life, with its empty routine and muted colors, felt like a distant memory from a different lifetime. There was a profound sense of recognition in the way she tilted her head, a silent acknowledgement that we were both searching for the same piece of ourselves in the other. I didn't know what to say, and it didn't matter because words felt clumsy and inadequate for the weight of this moment. I just stood there, breathing in the scent of her, a delicate mix of expensive floral soap and the faint, lingering sweetness of the drink she'd shared with me. It was an intoxicating combination that made my head swim. I took a half step toward her, the tiles beneath my feet cold, but the space between us burning hot. Her hand rose, trembling slightly as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, her touch feather-light against my skin. That single contact sent a spark of pure, unadulterated lightning straight through my veins. It was the simplest gesture, yet it carried the weight of a confession, a silent request that I was more than ready to grant. My gaze dropped to her lips, parted and soft, and I felt a desperate, urgent need to know what they felt like. She seemed to read the intention in my eyes, her own breath hitching as she leaned in, closing the final gap between us. When our lips finally met, the world ceased to exist, replaced entirely by the sensation of her. It wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced before. It was a revelation that hit me harder than I could have imagined. The softness was the first thing that stunned me, a velvet texture that made my knees feel like they were about to give way. I had spent my entire life thinking I knew what a kiss was, but this was a completely different language, a dialect of intimacy I was learning in real time. Her lips were so incredibly delicate, yielding under mine with a grace that felt like it had been waiting for me for an eternity. I felt a surge of wonder, a quiet gasp escaping me as I realized that the touch of a woman was a universe of tenderness I hadn't known existed. When she deepened the kiss, the sensation of her tongue against mine was a soft, warm intrusion that sent a jolt of pure joy through my system. It was so impossibly smooth, a gentle exploration that made my senses heighten until I felt as though I was floating above the tiled floor. I never thought a woman's kiss could be this soft, this wondrous, and this intensely transformative. It was the best thing I had ever felt, a rush of sweetness that felt like finally coming home to a place I hadn't realized I was missing. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her flush against me, needing to be closer, to erase any remaining distance. She sighed into my mouth, a sound of pure relief that mirrored exactly what was happening in my own heart. I felt as if the layers of ice surrounding my soul were cracking and melting away in the heat of her response. Every doubt, every fear, and every moment of loneliness I had carried for years seemed to vanish, replaced by the sheer perfection of this one, singular connection. We broke apart eventually, gasping for air, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to recalibrate. Her eyes were glazed with a dazed, beautiful shock, and I saw my own reflection in her gaze, looking back with a brightness I didn't recognize. We were both trembling, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just transpired in the quiet of this room. The quiet hum of the lights above us seemed amplified, the only sound in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. I didn't want to let go, but the reality of the bar outside began to seep back into my awareness. We were still in a public place, and the sheer intensity of the moment was something we had to process, something we had to protect. I could feel her heart racing against mine, a frantic, happy bird seeking sanctuary. We stood there for several long seconds, caught in the afterglow of a discovery that was going to change the trajectory of everything I had ever planned. I looked at her, and she squeezed my hand, a silent signal that we were both feeling the same dizzying, terrifying thrill. We couldn't stay here, not when the world was waiting just on the other side of that door. And the weight of what we had done felt like a heavy, golden secret. I knew that leaving the safety of this hallway would mean facing the consequences of our sudden intimacy. I took a shaky breath, smoothed my shirt, and nodded toward the exit, ready to face the night with a heart that was finally beating. Leaving the bar felt like walking out of a dream, and back into a world that no longer looked the same. The night air of Los Angeles hit us immediately, cool and sharp against the flushed heat of our skin. I couldn't stop thinking about the feeling of her breath against my cheek, a sensation that seemed to imprint itself right into my nerves. We walked side by side, our fingers brushing occasionally, a rhythmic contact that signaled we were not ready to part ways. The city was alive in a way I had never noticed before, bathed in the electric hum of streetlights and distant traffic. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every passerby looked like a blurry extra in the movie of our unfolding night. I glanced at her, watching the way she navigated the sidewalk with a newfound confidence that mirrored my own. We didn't speak, but the silence was thick with the weight of what we had just discovered in that small tiled room. We found a taxi idling at the corner, its yellow paint dull under the harsh glow of the street lamp. Opening the door for her felt like an act of devotion, a small gesture to keep the protective bubble we had built intact. As she climbed inside, the scent of her perfume followed her, a lingering sweetness that cut through the stale air of the vehicle. I slid in beside her, careful to leave just enough space, even though every cell in my body screamed to close the distance. Inside the cab, the world slowed down to a crawl, the streetlights outside passing by in steady rhythmic flashes of amber and white. The driver's radio played a low, melodic jazz tune that seemed to underscore the heaviness of the atmosphere between us. I stared out the window, watching the city blur past, but my mind was entirely focused on the woman sitting 2 inches away from me. The leather seat felt hot against my leg, a reminder of the physical proximity that was making my heart race. I stole a glance at her, catching the way the neon light from the signs outside painted patterns on her skin. She was looking down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap, her expression unreadable and soft. I wanted to reach out and pull those hands into mine, to let her know that she wasn't alone in this sudden, overwhelming current. But I stayed still, letting the tension simmer, afraid that one wrong move might shatter the fragile glass of the evening. Her hand shifted slightly, her pinky finger grazing the side of my palm, a deliberate touch that felt like a jolt of electricity. I held my breath, afraid that even a small movement might break the connection, and slowly turned my hand to catch hers. When our fingers finally interlaced, her skin was cool and soft, a perfect anchor against the rising tide of my own heartbeat. It was a simple, quiet admission of everything we couldn't say in words. I wondered if she was terrified, or if she was feeling the same desperate urge to rewrite her entire existence in a single night. This wasn't just a physical attraction. It was the dawning realization that the emptiness I had lived with for so long was finally being filled. The fear of what tomorrow would bring, the reality of her being a visitor, and me being anchored here, lurked at the edges of my mind. But right now, in the back of this moving car, I didn't care about tomorrow. The city lights seemed to dance in the darkness, mirroring the chaotic, beautiful swirl of emotions inside my chest. I felt like a teenager again, clumsy and filled with an intensity that I had thought was reserved for younger, less broken versions of myself. Everything I had built, the architecture, the careful boundaries, the solitary structure of my days, felt like it was rearranging itself around her. It was a terrifying, wonderful collapse of everything I thought I knew. She turned her head toward me, and in the dim light of the passing street lamps, I saw her smile, small and hesitant. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she squeezed my fingers, a silent message that traveled straight to the center of my being. I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye, a sudden sharp relief that I had found someone who understood this strange, quiet desperation. We were 2 ships lost in the same ocean, and for once, we were steering toward the same shore. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild bird seeking flight. And I could tell by the way she watched me that she felt it too. There was no more pretense. No more hiding behind the noise of the game or the anonymity of the crowd. We were just Harper and May, 2 souls adrift who had somehow collided in the best possible way. The distance between us felt like a lie that we were finally, joyfully, starting to dismantle. When the taxi slowed down, the familiar silhouette of my apartment building loomed ahead, a structure that had always felt like a fortress of solitude. It looked different tonight, as if the lights in the windows were watching us, waiting to see what we would bring inside. I felt a surge of panic. Would she come upstairs? Or would this be the moment where reality forced us apart? The prospect of her leaving, of going back to a hotel where I couldn't reach her, felt like a physical blow. The car came to a complete stop, the silence of the street wrapping around us like a heavy velvet blanket. I looked at her, my hand still gripping hers with a desperation that I didn't bother to hide anymore. She looked up at the building, then back at me, her dark eyes shimmering with a mixture of uncertainty and undeniable longing. This was the threshold of everything, the moment where the night would either end or become the beginning of a life I had never dared to dream. Stepping out of the taxi, the humid night air of Los Angeles wrapped around us like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The street was quiet, the distant roar of the stadium completely replaced by the rhythmic hum of crickets and passing cars. I reached out to close the cab door, my hand brushing against hers for a fleeting second, leaving a trail of fire on my skin. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the silhouette of my apartment building looming against the starlit sky. It felt like we were standing on the edge of a new world, completely cut off from the reality we had left behind at the bar. We began the short walk toward the front entrance, our paces perfectly synchronized as if we had been walking together for years. The sidewalk was cool beneath my shoes, but inside my chest, a reckless kind of heat was blooming with every breath I took. I could feel her eyes on me, a steady, curious gaze that made my pulse flutter erratically against my ribs. There was no need for words between us, as the silence carried the heavy weight of the discovery we had made in that quiet restroom hallway. Every step felt deliberate, a conscious choice to move closer to a future I hadn't dared to dream of until today. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the lobby, the sudden rush of cool, air-conditioned air hitting us like a wave of relief. The space was brightly lit and completely empty, our footsteps echoing softly against the polished marble floor as we crossed toward the elevators. The anonymity of the building felt comforting, a temporary sanctuary where the judgments and expectations of the outside world couldn't reach us. I glanced at her profile, watching the way the bright lights caught the porcelain perfection of her skin and the deep black of her long hair. She looked so incredibly beautiful. A sudden burst of pure color in the monochrome existence I had lived for so long. I pressed the button for the lift, the soft metallic click sounding loud in the quiet space of the lobby. We stood side by side, waiting for the doors to open, the space between our bodies charged with an electric, undeniable tension. I could hear the shallow rhythm of her breathing, a soft, delicate sound that seemed to synchronize with the rapid thudding of my own heart. It was a dizzying experience to be this close to someone, to feel their presence so intensely without a single word being spoken. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, the door sliding open to reveal the small enclosed space that would carry us upward. We stepped inside, and the doors slid shut behind us, locking us into a private world that felt entirely separate from the rest of the universe. The mechanical hum of the elevator moving upward was the only sound breaking the thick, loaded silence that enveloped us. I stared at the metal wall, watching our reflections blur together in the brushed surface, our silhouettes overlapping in the dim lighting. She shifted her weight, her shoulder pressing lightly against mine, a small, deliberate contact that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into the touch, anchoring myself to her warmth. The numbers on the display ticked upward, a slow countdown to the moment where we would step into the absolute privacy of my home. I looked down at her hands, her fingers still loosely curled into a fist, tracking the slight tremor that betrayed her own nervous excitement. I wanted to reach out and interlace my fingers with hers, to reassure her that she was safe with me, but the anticipation was too heavy to break. It felt as if we were suspended in time, floating between the reality of who we were before the match and who we were becoming now. The air in the elevator felt thick, heavy with the scent of her floral perfume and the unexpressed desire between us. When the elevator finally reached my floor, the soft chime felt like a sudden release of the pressure that had been building in my chest. The doors slid open, revealing the long, carpeted hallway, lined with identical wooden doors that had always felt so cold and welcoming in their predictability. We stepped out onto the soft carpet, our movements slow and hesitant as if we were reluctant to break the spell of the enclosed lift. The lighting in the corridor was dim, casting long, soft shadows ahead of us as we walked toward the end of the hall. I could feel the gravity of the situation pulling at me, a terrifying, beautiful realization of what was waiting on the other side of my door. We reached my apartment door and I stopped, my hand moving automatically toward the pocket where I kept my keys. The metal felt cold against my shaking fingers as I pulled the keychain out, the small jingle of the keys sounding incredibly loud in the quiet hallway. I stood there for a second, staring at the numbers on the door, realizing that this was the threshold of a complete transformation. For years, this apartment had been a place where I came to hide from my loneliness, a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. Now, it was about to become the setting for something raw, honest, and completely outside my comfort zone. I lifted the key toward the lock, but my hand was trembling so much that the metal scraped against the plate with a sharp scratching sound. I felt a sudden flux of embarrassment heat my cheeks, my confidence deserting me under the intense focus of her gaze. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, letting the cool air of the hallway ground me against the chaotic swirl of my emotions. She stepped closer, closing the final inch of space between us, until I could feel the radiating warmth of her body pressing against my back. Her proximity was an intoxicating thing, a silent command that completely melted away my hesitation. She reached out, her cool hand gently resting over mine, her fingers steadying my wrist with a firm, reassuring pressure that made my breath hitch. I looked down at our joined hands against the dark wood of the door, the contrast between her pale skin and my sun-bronzed fingers looking incredibly beautiful. With her guidance, the key slid smoothly into the lock, the mechanical tumblers turning with a heavy, satisfying click that signaled the opening of the path. She didn't pull her hand away immediately, letting her fingers linger against my skin for a long, breathless heartbeat that sent a hum through my nerves. I turned around slowly to look at her one last time before opening the door, our faces so close that our breaths mingled in the small space between us. Her dark eyes were wide and filled with a deep, burning intensity that mirrored exactly what was happening in my own heart. The hesitation that had marked her expressions earlier was entirely gone, replaced by a resolute, beautiful longing that made my knees feel weak. I could see the reflection of the hallway lights dancing in her eyes, a flickering pattern of gold that matches the wild rhythm of my pulse. There was no more running, no more hiding behind the language barrier. We were completely exposed to each other. I pushed the door open, letting it swing back into the dark stillness of the entryway, the familiar outlines of my furniture waiting in the shadows. I stepped inside, pulling her gently along with me, the warm familiarity of my space suddenly feeling charged with a brand new electric purpose. The outside world, with its stadium roars and busy city streets, vanished completely as the door began to swing shut behind us. I knew that the second that door clicked into place, my old life would be gone forever, replaced by the magnificent, terrifying journey we were about to begin together. The lock clicked shut, echoing in the quiet apartment like a thunderclap. We stood in the entryway, the silence between us heavy and charged with everything we hadn't said during the ride home. I dropped my keys on the small table, my hands trembling as the reality of her presence in my space finally hit me. May watched me, her eyes dark and questioning, her posture shifting from guarded to something infinitely more daring. We were no longer two strangers at a game. We were two people standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to jump. I turned back to face her, and the distance that had felt safe in the taxi now felt like an unbearable chasm. Without a word, I stepped closer, my pulse thudding in my ears like a drumbeat. She met me halfway, her hand reaching out to touch my waist, a firm and deliberate claim that made the air vanish from my lungs. The scent of her, that mix of floral perfume and the city night, filled my senses, making me dizzy with longing. The first touch was electric, a searing spark that ignited every nerve ending in my body. She pulled me against her, and for a second, I was lost in the absolute certainty that I wanted this more than anything I had ever known. My hands found the back of her neck, tangling in her sleek hair as I pulled her closer, desperate to bridge the space between us. There was no hesitation now, only the overwhelming force of desire and the reckless abandonment of everything that had kept us apart. Her lips met mine with an intensity that took my breath away. a fierce and hungry answer to the questioning look I had seen in her eyes. The kiss was deep, a collision of heat and emotion that tasted like wine and desperation. I had never realized how soft a woman could be, how the incredible tenderness of her touch could be simultaneously so powerful. It was a sensation of velvet meeting velvet, a softness that was both a sanctuary and a fire. My hands explored the curves of her waist and back, marveling at the strength beneath the delicacy of her skin. She moved with me, her body perfectly attuned to the shifting rhythm of our breaths and the deepening urgency of our movements. Every touch felt like a discovery, a new map I was learning to navigate by instinct alone. I felt a sense of freedom that was completely intoxicating, as if I had finally found the part of myself that had been dormant for decades. We moved toward the bedroom, a blur of motion guided by the magnetic pull of our connection. The room was bathed in the soft blue glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. I felt her skin cool and smooth against my own, a contrast that only heightened the frantic heat of my heartbeat. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us in this small, quiet sanctuary. As we sank onto the bed, the reality of the moment washed over me, a tidal wave of emotion I couldn't contain. She looked at me, her expression a mix of awe and desire, and I knew that this was the most honest I had ever been in my entire life. Her hands were gentle, tracing the line of my jaw and the hollow of my throat as if she were memorizing my existence. I felt cherished, seen, and completely, terrifyingly exposed in the most beautiful way possible. The intimacy between us grew, fueled by the silence of the room and the shared desperation to be closer than we already were. There was no need for words, no need to explain the language of our desire, as our bodies communicated in a way that was primal and profound. I was struck by the incredible softness of her, the way her tongue tasted against mine, a delicate and wonderful sensation that was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It was a journey of discovery, a new landscape of pleasure and warmth that I explored with a shaking, reverent touch. I felt her breath hitch against my skin, a sound that sent a jolt of heat straight to my center. The depth of the connection was overwhelming, a weight that grounded me even as I felt like I was drifting into the stars. We were lost in the rhythm of our own creation, a dance of hands and lips and soft sighs that echoed in the quiet of the night. Every movement was a question and an answer, a dialogue of passion that left no room for doubt or fear. The intensity kept rising, a slow, inevitable climb toward a peak I hadn't known I could reach. I was conscious of every touch, every gasp, every moment where her skin met mine, etching each sensation into my memory forever. It felt as if we were rewriting the history of our own souls, shedding the skin of who we used to be become something new together. In that space, there was only the warmth, the desire, and the profound, life-changing knowledge that I was loved. The world narrowed down to the space between our bodies, and for a while, there was nothing else but the heavy, rhythmic breathing and the soft, tangled heat of our union. We let the night wash over us, surrendering to the tide of our own emotions as the city hummed along, indifferent and far away. The night became a blur of soft touches and deep, lingering kisses, a memory of absolute, perfect bliss that I knew would never truly fade. Eventually, the frantic pace slowed, leaving us wrapped in the quiet, lingering aftermath of our discovery. I lay there in the dark, listening to her steady heartbeat, feeling a sense of peace that was so profound it almost hurt. This was the redemptive power of love I had read about, but never dared to believe in, and it was better than any dream. I drifted off into a restless but happy sleep, completely unaware that the morning would bring a reality I wasn't yet prepared to face. The morning light felt aggressive, slicing through the blinds and cutting across my face with a harshness that matched the throbbing in my head. I opened my eyes, the room spinning slightly as the remnants of the night before settled into a heavy, dull ache behind my temples. The silence of the apartment was profound, and for a split second, I felt a sense of peace, expecting to reach out and find her right beside me. When my hand touched the empty space on the mattress, the reality of the morning rushed back with a cold, sharp sting. My head pounded with every beat of my heart, a punishing reminder of the alcohol we had consumed to blur the edges of our reality. I sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to my chest, and looked over at the armchair where she had curled up earlier. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of the seat, her clothes clutched in her hands, her back turned to me. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, drained of the warmth that had defined our night together. I watched her shoulders shake, a subtle rhythmic motion that signaled she was crying. My heart dropped, the golden glow of our intimacy fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. I reached out, wanting to comfort her, but I stopped, unsure of what the sudden distance meant. The language barrier felt like a massive wall rising between us, blocking the path back to the connection we had built only hours before. She turned to look at me, her eyes red and puffy, her expression a fragile mix of confusion and deep, burning shame. She tried to say something, a soft, fragmented string of words in her native language that sounded like an apology, or perhaps a prayer. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that there was nothing to apologize for, but my own tongue felt heavy and useless. The weight of her embarrassment was crushing, pulling the air out of the room. She stood up and began to dress with frantic, hurried movements, her hands fumbling with buttons that wouldn't cooperate. It was clear that the reality of the situation had hit her with the force of a tidal wave, and she was already retreating, trying to undo what had happened. I watched her, feeling the panic rise in my throat, a suffocating realization that I might lose the best thing that had ever happened to me. I reached out to grab her wrist, but she pulled away, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she couldn't bear to look at me. Just as I was about to find the words to stop her, a sharp, insistent knocking erupted at my front door. My heart jumped, a frantic bird in my chest, as I scrambled to cover myself with the blanket. It was too early for anyone, and the sudden intrusion felt like a violation of the fragile bubble we were trapped in. I checked the time on my phone, cursing under my breath, as the knocking grew louder and more impatient. I stumbled to the door, pulling my robe tight, hoping that whoever it was would just go away. When I opened the door, I found Giovanna, a colleague from the office, holding a stack of files and looking entirely too bright and cheery for this hour. She breezed past me, talking about a project deadline, her presence a jarring, chaotic intrusion into the intimacy of my apartment. I tried to block her view of the bedroom, my mind racing to find a way to get her out before she saw May. Giovanna didn't notice my distress. She was too busy complaining about the printer and asking where I had left the updated floor plans. Her voice was loud, an abrasive sound that echoed through my head and seemed to make May's distress worse. I could hear May moving in the other room, a soft, muffled sound that I prayed Giovanna wouldn't hear over her own chatter. I answered in short, clipped sentences, hoping to usher her out without raising suspicion. Giovanna finally found the file she was looking for, but she paused, her gaze drifting toward the bedroom door. She asked if I was alone, her voice dipping into that curious, slightly invasive tone that made my blood run cold. I lied quickly, saying I was exhausted and just wanted to sleep, pushing her toward the door with an urgency I couldn't disguise. She finally took the hint, offering a strange look before stepping out into the hallway. I slammed the door shut and leaned my forehead against it, my breathing ragged. When I turned back toward the bedroom, I saw May standing in the doorway, her bag already packed, her face a mask of resolute withdrawal. She looked at me, and I saw the resignation in her eyes, the decision already made to leave and never look back. The interruption of my coworker had only confirmed her suspicion that what we shared was something that couldn't survive in the light of day. She walked toward the front door, her head bowed, her movements precise and cold. I followed her, my voice breaking as I tried to call out to her, to make her stop, to make her listen to what I couldn't quite put into words. She didn't turn back, her hand already on the handle, ready to vanish into the morning light and leave me in the wreckage of my own apartment. The feeling of absolute, devastating loss was so sharp, it almost knocked me to my knees. She turned the handle, the door creaking open just enough to let in the bright, unfiltered sun of the city. I felt the finality of it, the cold, hard end of the miracle I had held in my arms only hours ago. I knew that if she walked through that door, I would lose the anchor I didn't know I needed until she arrived. I had to do something, anything, or the silence would be the only thing I had left. I didn't let her pull away this time. My hand moved on instinct, gripping the edge of the door to keep it from swinging any further. The hallway was empty, and the silence that followed the slamming of my apartment door was loud enough to make my head spin. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight with the terrifying thought of her slipping out of my life before it had even truly begun. I looked at her back, the tension in her shoulders screaming that she wanted to be anywhere but here, and I knew I had to shatter the distance between us. I reached out, my fingers finding her arm, and I felt her flinch at the contact. I didn't let go. Instead, I gently turned her around so she had to face me. Her eyes were swimming with tears, the shame so raw and painful that it cut through my own exhaustion like a knife. I wanted to tell her that there was nothing to hide from, that the night we shared was the only real thing that had happened to me in years. I opened my mouth, but the words were caught in the lump in my throat, tangled by the weight of my own vulnerability. For years, I had worn my life like a suit of armor, acting as if I had everything under control. I was the architect who built homes for other people, the woman who had her life organized into perfect, manageable squares. My mask was so well constructed that even I had started to believe the lie that I didn't need anyone. But looking at her, I felt that armor crumbling piece by piece, until I was just a woman standing in a doorway, terrified of the silence that awaited me without her. I started to speak, my voice shaky and raw, as I tried to explain the truth of my existence. I told her about the 2 tickets I always bought, about the empty chairs at the movies, and the silent dinners I ate alone. I confessed that I had been sleepwalking through my life, waiting for a spark to light the way, and that she was the only one who had ever made me feel awake. It sounded pathetic, the truth of my loneliness laid bare like that, but it was the only thing I had to offer. I saw the way her expression shifted as I spoke, the shame in her eyes giving way to a bewildered, quiet shock. She listened, her attention focused entirely on me, as if she were trying to piece together the narrative of my heart. I wasn't a powerful architect or a put-together professional in this moment. I was just a person, small and afraid, asking for a reason to keep believing in something better. I told her that she wasn't just a tourist, not to me, and that the connection we felt was a miracle I couldn't walk away from. She stood frozen, her hands still clutching her bag, the knuckles white from the pressure. She didn't try to pull away from my touch. Her gaze locked onto mine with a depth that felt like she was reading every line of my confession. I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the battle between her fear and the undeniable reality of what we had found together. It was a beautiful, painful thing to watch, the way she contemplated staying in the path of the storm. I told her about the strength I saw in her, the way she had left everything behind to travel across the world alone. I admitted that I was the one who was truly lost, that I had been hiding in my fortress of solitude because I didn't have the courage to be seen. Her courage had been the mirror I needed to see my own cowardice and the hope I had been missing all these years. I pleaded with her, not with words of grand romance, but with the quiet, desperate truth of a woman who had finally found her home. The tears in her eyes were spilling over now, tracks of liquid silver tracing paths down her porcelain skin. She let out a ragged breath, the sound breaking the tension that had been hanging over us like a guillotine. She looked at the door, then back at me, her expression softening into something incredibly tender. I felt my heart stop as she slowly let go of the door handle, the metallic click echoing like a promise in the hallway. I didn't stop talking, letting every insecurity and every hidden dream pour out into the space between us. I told her that if she left now, I would go back to that gray, silent life, and I didn't think I could survive it a second time. My voice was thick with emotion, a symphony of all the things I had suppressed for so long. She stepped closer, her hand coming up to rest on my chest, right over the frantic, erratic beat of my heart. She murmured something, the cadence of her voice soft and rhythmic, a lullaby of forgiveness in a language I still couldn't understand. I didn't need to translate the words because the intent was written in the way she looked at me. She was seeing me, really seeing me, beneath the architect and the professional and the lonely woman. It was a terrifying, wonderful sensation to be known so completely by someone who barely knew my name. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, so strong it made my knees buckle. She reached out, her fingers cupping my face, her touch warm and grounding against my cool, damp skin. I leaned into her, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a hope that felt as bright and overwhelming as the sun outside. We were standing in the threshold of something new, a fragile bridge built out of honesty and the desperate, beautiful desire to be together. I could see the resolve in her eyes, the decision that she wasn't walking through that door, at least not alone. She took a step toward me, closing the distance, and the air around us seemed to shift, lightening with the weight of our shared truth. I knew that whatever happened next, the version of me that had been alone yesterday was gone forever, replaced by someone who was finally capable of being loved. My future was standing right there in the hallway, looking at me with hope, and I was ready to follow her anywhere. The lock clicked shut, echoing in the quiet entryway, as if sealing away the turmoil that had nearly driven her out of my life. I didn't let go, my hand still firm on the door to ensure she wouldn't try to leave again. She stood there, her breath hitched, looking at me with eyes that were shimmering with a mix of exhaustion and a burgeoning quiet relief. The silence that followed felt heavy, but this time it wasn't the suffocating kind. It was a space where the truth had finally been allowed to settle. We were two people standing on the edge of everything, waiting for the ground to stop shaking. I stepped closer, ignoring the tremor in my own hands as I reached out to touch her cheek. Her skin was cool, still damp with the traces of the tears she had shed only moments ago. I didn't say a word, letting the sincerity of my touch speak for all the things I couldn't articulate in a language she didn't fully share. She leaned into my palm, a small, trusting gesture that made my resolve harden into something unbreakable. I realized then that my armor hadn't just cracked, it had fallen away entirely. Our second kiss began not with the desperate hunger of the night before, but with a deliberate, slow-burning promise. Her lips were soft, yielding against mine with a grace that felt like an invitation to a life I hadn't dared to sketch. There was no alcohol to blur the edges, no adrenaline from a stadium crowd to mask the intimacy of the moment. There was only the pure, terrifying clarity of our connection. It felt like standing in the calm center of a storm, grounded and absolutely certain of where I wanted to be. I could feel her hands tangling in my hair, pulling me closer as if she were trying to bridge every atom of distance between us. Her scent was still there, subtle and sweet, mixing with the morning air drifting in from the hallway. I felt a sob catch in my throat, not of sadness, but of the overwhelming joy of being known. For the first time, I wasn't just observing my life. I was an active, breathing part of it. I felt her heart beating against my own, a steady rhythm that anchored me to the earth. Her tongue brushed against mine, a gentle, exploratory touch that sent a jolt of warmth straight to the core of my being. I'd never imagined that a kiss could communicate so much without a single word being spoken. It was an apology for the fear, a gratitude for the honesty, and a pledge of trust that we would navigate the uncertainty of the future together. The softness of her was a revelation, a texture of pure, unfiltered beauty that I knew I would crave for the rest of my days. We pulled back just an inch, our foreheads resting together in the golden light filtering through the door. I traced the arch of her brow with my thumb, feeling the faint, rapid pulse at her temple. She looked at me, her expression unburdened by the shame that had been there only minutes before. It was a look of profound recognition, a silent admission that we had both finally stopped running from the parts of ourselves that were most afraid of being seen. She whispered something in her language, a soft melodic sound that I didn't need a dictionary to understand. The tone was one of absolute, unwavering commitment, a vow that hummed in the air between us. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me like a prayer, feeling the last of my defenses dissolve into the quiet of the morning. I didn't have to be the perfect professional or the woman who had it all together. I just needed to be with her. I pulled her into an embrace, my arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective intensity. She returned the gesture, holding me as if she were afraid that if she let go, I would drift back into the gray, hollow world I'd come from. We held each other in that small, sun-drenched hallway, two people who had found a reason to believe in the impossible. The apartment, once a fortress of solitude, now felt like the beginning of a future I was finally ready to inhabit. I led her back toward the living room, our hands still locked together in a tight, inseparable grip. We sat on the couch, the morning light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air around us. She looked at the stacks of blueprints on my table, not with the distant curiosity of a guest, but with the intent gaze of someone who belonged there. I realized that my life didn't need to be organized into squares anymore. It just needed to be shared. The fear of the morning, of the questions that would inevitably arise, felt like a distant, manageable thing compared to the intensity of what we had built. We spent the next hour just sitting in the quiet, talking in the broken, beautiful language of gestures and touch. I found myself telling her about the projects I'd built and the dreams I'd buried, and she listened with a focus that was the greatest gift I had ever received. It was a new chapter, the first line in a book I hadn't known I was allowed to write. I knew that the road ahead would be complicated, full of the realities of distance and the logistics of our very different lives. But looking at her, I felt a strength I had never tapped into before, a determination to make this work against whatever odds the world might throw at us. We had survived the stadium, the bar, and the crushing weight of the morning. We could survive anything. The connection we had was an anchor, a tether that kept me from drifting back into the static of my former life. The day stretched out before us, a long, sunlit expanse of possibility that felt completely brand new. As the city began to wake up around us, the sounds of traffic and sirens fading into the hum of the day, I knew we had only just started. We had moved from the loneliness of the stadium to the intimacy of the morning, and the next steps were waiting for us, uncharted and full of promise. But as I watched her laugh at a mistake I made in gesture, I knew that no matter where the path led, I would follow her to the end of the world. Time has a strange way of warping when you finally find the missing piece of your heart. It's been 3 weeks since that morning, and the gray, hollow routine I once called a life feels like a distant memory from someone else's biography. Every morning now starts not with the silence of an empty apartment, but with the soft rustle of movement and the scent of jasmine tea brewing in the kitchen. I never imagined that someone could come into my meticulously ordered world and dismantle it with such grace, leaving behind something so much warmer and more vibrant in its place. We moved past the initial awkwardness of those first few days with a speed that felt both terrifying and inevitable. My apartment, once a fortress designed to keep the world out, has become a shared sanctuary where we build our own language out of gestures, smiles, and glances. It's amazing how much you can say without a single word when you finally stop trying to hide who you are. May's presence here has turned the cold, minimalist space into a home that feels lived in, loved, and undeniably mine. The biggest shift, the one that still makes my breath catch, is the knowledge that she isn't leaving. She made the decision to stay in the United States, choosing to build a future here, with me, in the middle of a city that once felt like a cage. We've navigated the logistics of visa paperwork and personal sacrifices with a patience that has only strengthened the foundation of what we are creating. Seeing her settle into this life, with her things mixed in with mine, is a daily miracle I haven't quite stopped marveling at. Our days are filled with the small, beautiful details of a shared existence that I used to think were reserved for other people. We cook dinner together, navigating the kitchen with a rhythm that has become second nature, laughing at my attempts to learn her favorite recipes. There is a profound comfort in the routine of our evenings, the way we unwind on the couch, talking until the late hours about dreams, fears, and the strange path that brought us together. I've realized that the greatest luxury isn't the architecture I design, but the quiet moments of companionship I share with her. We've also learned to communicate in ways that go far beyond the spoken word, finding meaning in the touch of a hand or the way she leans into me when the world feels too loud. My friends at work have noticed the change in me, a lightness in my step, and a spark in my eyes that they can't quite put their fingers on. I don't tell them everything, but I carry the secret of us like a precious glowing ember close to my heart. It's a connection that doesn't require validation from anyone else, because we both know how real it is. Today is the day of the final match, the culmination of the World Cup that served as the backdrop for the most transformative summer of my life. The city outside is buzzing with an energy that feels different now, less chaotic and more purposeful. We're heading back to the stadium, the very place where we first locked eyes and changed the course of our futures. I pull on my jersey, feeling a thrill of anticipation that has nothing to do with the sport and everything to do with who is holding my hand. Walking through the streets of Los Angeles, I feel like a completely different person than the one who paced these same sidewalks alone a few short weeks ago. The sun is just as hot, the asphalt just as radiating, but the sting of the heat is gone, replaced by the warmth of her fingers interlaced with mine. I stop for a second to look at her, really look at her, and I see the reflection of my own happiness in her bright, confident smile. We are walking toward the stadium, not as two ghosts in a crowd, but as a team. We arrive at the stadium gates, and the memories of that first lonely afternoon come rushing back to me with a bittersweet clarity. I remember the woman I was, standing in that row, feeling like an outsider, looking into a world I couldn't touch. But now, as we pass through the security check, I feel a sense of belonging that is deeply rooted in the person walking beside me. The stadium is vast and intimidating, but it feels like the arena where we won the only prize that actually matters. The match itself is a blur of intense action and collective roaring, but I find myself spending more time watching her reactions than the players on the pitch. She is radiant, her excitement bubbling over in a way that makes the entire world feel brighter. We cheer in unison, our voices blending together, a part of the overwhelming energy of the crowd. I realize that I don't need to understand the game perfectly to understand that this is the best I have ever felt. In the middle of the excitement, she turns to me, her eyes meeting mine with a depth of emotion that leaves me breathless. There is a peace in her gaze, a serenity that confirms everything I felt when I asked her not to leave. We don't need to say anything. The look is a conversation of love, trust, and the beautiful, terrifying thrill of our future. I realize that I am no longer waiting for my life to start, because it started the moment I found her. As the clock counts down the final minutes, I lean into her, feeling the solid, grounding pressure of her shoulder against mine. This isn't just about a game anymore. It's a celebration of the love that saved me from the hollow shell I used to inhabit. I feel a sense of victory that is total and absolute, a triumph of the heart that transcends any sporting event. I am no longer invisible, no longer alone, and no longer afraid of the person I see in the mirror. I hold her hand tighter as the crowd erupts in the final cheer, and I know that whatever life brings us, we have won. Thank you so much for being here with us on this journey, and if you loved this story, don't forget to follow our channel, RP, Romantic Promises, and hit the like button for more tales of love that defy the odds. I'm Harper, and I've finally found my own trophy, the most precious prize of all.